Elara Voss was 9 years old the night she sat on a plastic chair in a hospital hallway, her shoes not quite touching the floor, and listened to a nurse explain that both her parents were gone. A truck driver had fallen asleep at the wheel on Route 11, just outside Harlan County, Kentucky. It was January 2009. The temperature outside was 4 degrees, and the little girl with the tangled brown hair and the oversized coat that smelled like her mother's perfume had exactly no one left in the world. No grandparents, no aunts, no uncles anyone could find. Her mother had been an only child raised in foster care herself, and her father had come from people who did not want to be found. That is what the social worker told her 3 days later while packing her things into a black garbage bag, because apparently that is what the state of Kentucky gave you when your childhood ended. Not a suitcase, a trash bag. Elara spent the next 8 years in the foster system. 4 homes in 4 different towns. She does not talk about what happened in the second one. The third family was kind but poor, and when the father got sick, they could not keep her. The fourth family forgot her birthday twice, which might not sound like much, but when you are a child with no one, a forgotten birthday is a door closing in your face. She aged out of the system at 17. No savings, no family. A GED she had earned by studying in a laundromat, because her last foster home did not have a desk. She worked at a gas station in Whitesburg for 2 years, then a diner in Pikeville for 3 more. She slept in a rented room above a hardware store that leaked when it rained. She kept a shoebox under her bed with exactly 2 things inside: her mother's driver's license, the photo cracked and faded, and a prayer card from her father's funeral, the only evidence she had that he had ever existed at all. She was 25 years old when the letter arrived. It came in a manila envelope with no return address, just a law office stamp from a town called Viper, Kentucky, a place so small it did not even have its own post office anymore. The letter inside was 1 page, typed on paper so old it felt like cloth. It said that a woman named Constance Alder Voss had died at the age of 91, and that she had left a single piece of property to the only surviving member of the Voss line, Elara. Constance Alder Voss. The name meant nothing to her. She had never heard it spoken in her father's house, never seen it on a Christmas card, never found it in any document the state had kept. But the letter included a photograph, and when Elara turned it over, her chest went tight. It was a chapel, small, white clapboard, sitting alone on a hillside surrounded by black trees stripped bare by winter. A steeple leaned slightly to the left, and the front door was painted blue, though the paint had peeled so badly it looked like the wood was shedding skin. Across the bottom of the photograph, in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible, someone had written 1 sentence: "She will know why." The property transfer fee was $300. Elara paid it with money she had saved by eating 1 meal a day for 6 weeks. The attorney, a man named Boggs, who sounded like he was 100 years old himself, told her over the phone that the chapel had been closed since 1971. Over 50 years sealed shut. He said the county had tried to condemn it twice, but Constance had fought them both times, paying the taxes out of a pension check that could not have been more than a few $100s a month. She had kept that chapel alive, with almost nothing, for decades, and she had never once set foot inside it. When Elara asked why, Boggs was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Some things are kept not because they are useful. They are kept because letting go would mean admitting something that cannot be admitted." Elara drove to Viper on a Thursday in February. The road wound through mountains so steep the trees grew sideways, their roots clinging to rock like fingers gripping a ledge. Snow had fallen the night before, and the world was white and still and completely silent in that way that only Appalachian winters know, where the cold itself seems to have a sound, a low hum that presses against your eardrums. She found the chapel at the end of a gravel road that had not been maintained in years. Her truck bounced over frozen ruts and exposed roots, the suspension groaning with every dip. When she finally stopped and stepped out, The cold hit her face like an open hand. Her breath hung in the air in front of her, and for a moment she just stood there, her boots sinking into 3 inches of snow, staring at the building that now belonged to her. It was smaller than the photograph had suggested, maybe 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, with 4 windows on each side, every one of them boarded shut from the outside. The blue door was padlocked with a chain so rusted it had turned the wood around it orange. The steeple was missing its cross. In every competition, a smile can be your secret strength. In every competition, a smile can be your secret strength. The whole structure seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Alara walked to the door. She could smell the chapel before she touched it. Old wood, frozen earth, and something else underneath. Something sweet and faintly chemical, like the ghost of varnish or old candle wax trapped in the walls for half a century. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the key Boggs had mailed her. It was iron, heavy, the kind of key that belongs to a different century. She fitted it into the padlock. It took both hands and all her weight to turn it, but when the lock finally gave way, the chain fell to the ground with a sound like bones hitting stone. She pushed the door open. The cold inside was different from the cold outside. Outside, the cold was alive, moving, carried by wind. Inside the chapel, the cold was still, preserved. It had been sitting in this space for 55 years, undisturbed, settling into every surface like sediment at the bottom of a lake. The air tasted of dust and something metallic, like old pennies or blood. She stepped inside, and her footsteps echoed off the wooden floor in a way that made her feel watched. The pews were still there, 12 of them, 6 on each side, made of dark oak that had gone nearly black with age. Hymnals sat in the racks on the backs of the pews, their pages swollen with moisture, frozen into solid blocks. A wood stove stood in the corner, its chimney pipe disappearing into the ceiling. A neat stack of firewood still sitting beside it, as if someone had intended to return the next Sunday but never did. And at the front of the chapel, the altar. It was simple. A wooden table draped with a cloth that had once been white but had turned the color of weak tea. Behind it, a wooden cross hung on the wall, hand-carved, the chisel marks still visible in the grain. And on the altar itself, arranged with the care of someone who understood that placement is a kind of prayer, sat 3 objects. A Bible closed, its leather cover cracked but intact. A glass vase with the dried remains of wildflowers, their stems frozen into brittle threads, and a tape recorder. A small portable cassette player from the 1960s, the kind with a single speaker and 2 silver buttons, play and stop. Alara stared at it. Her hands were shaking, and not just from the cold. She walked forward slowly, her boots leaving prints in the dust that covered the floor like a gray carpet. When she reached the altar, she stood there for a long time, just looking. The tape recorder had a cassette inside it. She could see the brown ribbon of tape through the clear window on the front. She pressed play. For 3 seconds there was nothing. Just the hiss and crackle of old tape, the sound of time itself compressed into magnetic ribbon. Then a voice. It was a woman's voice, low and steady, with the accent of the mountains. The vowels stretched long and the consonants softened. The way people spoke in these hills before television smoothed everyone's words into the same flat tone. The voice said, "If you are hearing this, then you are the one I have been waiting for. My name is Constance. I am your grandmother." Alara's knees buckled. She grabbed the edge of the altar to keep from falling. The wood was cold beneath her fingers, cold and rough, and she held onto it the way a drowning person holds onto a rope. The voice continued. "Your father was my son. His name was Daniel. He left this mountain when he was 18 years old, and I did not see him again for the rest of my life. That was my fault. Everything that happened was my fault. And this chapel is where I kept the truth he never wanted to hear." The tape crackled. Constance coughed, a small dry sound. Then she went on. "There are things under this altar, child. Things I could not carry alone. Things I could not destroy. If you have come this far, then you are strong enough to see them. But I need you to know something first. Whatever you find, It was done out of love. Even the terrible parts. Especially the terrible parts. The tape ended. The player clicked off with a mechanical finality that sounded like a door latch closing. Elara stood in the frozen silence of the chapel, her breath coming in shallow white puffs, and she realized she was crying. Not sobbing. Just a slow, quiet leak of tears that fell from her chin and hit the dusty altar cloth, leaving dark spots that spread like tiny bruises. She had a grandmother. She had a grandmother who knew her name, who had waited for her, who had kept a building standing for over 50 years just to hold a message in place. And her father, Daniel. He had known. He had known there was someone here, and he had chosen to walk away. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and knelt down. The altar was a box. She could see it now, the way the cloth draped over edges that were too sharp for a simple table. She pulled the cloth aside and found a wooden chest, roughly 3 feet long and 2 feet deep, built from the same dark oak as the pews. There was no lock, just a simple latch, green with oxidation. She opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept them dry for decades, were letters. Hundreds of them, stacked neatly, tied with kitchen string, each bundle labeled with a year written in the same shaky handwriting from the photograph. The earliest was 1953, the latest was 2008, the year before Elara's parents died. Beneath the letters was a second cassette tape, labeled simply, "For When You Are Ready." And beneath that, at the very bottom of the chest, was a deed. A property deed dated 1919, transferring ownership of 47 acres of mountain land, including the chapel and a homestead, to a man named Josiah Voss, Elara's great-great-grandfather. 47 acres. She owned 47 acres. She sat back on her heels and looked around the chapel with new eyes. The boarded windows, the frozen hymnals, the stove with its patient stack of wood. This was not just a chapel, it was a vault. A vault built by a woman who had spent her entire adult life guarding a secret she could not speak aloud. But the county did not see a vault. The county saw a code violation. 3 weeks after Elara moved a sleeping bag and a camp stove into the chapel, a man from the Harlan County Building Inspector's office drove up the gravel road in a white truck and told her she had 30 days to vacate. The structure was condemned, he said. No running water, no electricity, no certificate of occupancy. He handed her a yellow notice and told her that if she was not gone in 30 days, the county would demolish the building and send her the bill. His name was Greer. He had a thin mustache and eyes that never quite met hers. He looked at the chapel the way people look at things they have already decided are worthless. Elara took the yellow notice and said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that arguing with men like Greer was like arguing with a wall. The wall does not care what you think. But that night, lying in her sleeping bag on the chapel floor with her headlamp on and the letters spread around her like fallen leaves, she read. And what she read changed everything. Constance had written to Daniel every week for 55 years. Every single week. The letters began when he was born in 1953, and they continued long after he left, long after he stopped writing back, long after the silence between them hardened into something permanent. The early letters were what you would expect. A young mother writing to her infant son, recording his first words, his first steps, the way he laughed when she sang to him. But by the time Daniel was 12, the tone shifted. Constance began writing about a man named Harold Voss, Daniel's father, Elara's grandfather. Harold had been a coal miner, like most men in those hills. But Harold had also been something else. He had been violent, not the kind of violence that leaves marks other people can see, but the kind that fills a house with silence so thick you can feel it pressing against your skin. Constance described it in language that was careful, almost clinical, as if she were writing a report about someone else's life. He turned the chair over again tonight. Daniel did not cry this time. I think he is learning not to. By 1965, Harold was dead, a mine collapse. 7 men went in, 4 came out. Harold was not one of the 4. Constance was 28 years old, a widow with a 12-year-old son and 47 acres of mountain land that no one wanted. But the letters revealed something Constance had never told Daniel while he was alive. After Harold died, she found something in the mine records. Harold had not been just a miner. He had been a foreman, and he had falsified safety reports for 6 years to keep the mine operating after the company had been ordered to close it. The collapse that killed him had also killed 2 other men, and it was Harold's reports that had made it possible. Constance carried that knowledge for the rest of her life. She never told a soul. She wrote it in the letters, sealed them, and put them in the altar. She believed that Daniel had somehow known. Not the specifics, but the weight of it. "Children feel those things," she wrote. "They feel the shape of what you are hiding, even when they cannot see it. And I think that is why he left. Not because he did not love me, but because loving me meant standing next to a secret he could feel but never touch, and it was easier to walk away than to stay and wonder." Elara read until 3 in the morning, her fingers numb, her eyes burning, the temperature inside the chapel dropping to 19 degrees. She read about how Constance had tried to find Daniel, how she had hired a private investigator in 1982 with money she had saved from selling quilts at a roadside stand. The investigator had found Daniel living in a town called Whitesburg, married, working at a sawmill, and how Daniel had told the investigator that his mother was dead. "He told a stranger I was dead," Constance wrote. And maybe he was right. Maybe the mother he needed had died a long time ago. Maybe I killed her myself by keeping quiet. Elara put the letter down and pressed her palms flat against the cold floor, feeling the wood grain against her skin, feeling the years compressed beneath her like geological layers. Her father had lived 20 miles from this chapel, 20 miles, and he had told people his mother was dead, and Constance had kept writing to him anyway. Every week, for 26 more years. The next morning, Elara drove to the county clerk's office in Harlan and requested copies of the property records for the 47 acres. It took 2 hours and a clerk who seemed annoyed that anyone would ask about land in Viper, but eventually, Elara walked out with a folder full of documents that confirmed what the deed had said. The land was hers, legally, completely, and irrevocably hers. The taxes had been paid through 2025 by Constance's estate, which consisted of a savings account with exactly $412 remaining. Elara used $200 of that to buy a portable generator from a pawn shop in Harlan. She used the rest to buy plywood, nails, caulk, and a second-hand wood stovepipe to replace the one in the chapel that had rusted through. She did not know how to do any of this. She had never held a hammer with purpose, but she had watched YouTube videos on her phone at the gas station during her breaks for years, not dreaming, just absorbing, the way people who have nothing absorb everything. Because you never know when knowing something might be the difference between survival and surrender. She started with the windows. She pried the boards off one at a time, and the frozen nails screamed as they came out of the wood, a sound like small animals in pain. Behind the boards, the glass was intact on 6 of the 8 windows. The other 2 she covered with clear plastic sheeting and duct tape. When she finished, light entered the chapel for the first time in 55 years. And it changed everything. The dust that had been invisible in the dark became a galaxy of particles, spinning slowly in the pale winter sun, and the pews cast shadows that stretched across the floor like long fingers reaching for the altar. Word spread. In a place like Viper, it always does. The first person to come was a woman named Dottie Sloan, 73 years old, who had been Constance's neighbor for 40 years. Dottie drove up in a truck that was older than Elara and stood in the doorway of the chapel with her arms crossed, looking at the girl kneeling on the floor with a can of wood oil and a rag. "You look just like her," Dottie said. Elara looked up. "Your grandmother. Same jaw. Same way of holding your mouth like you are trying not to say something you might regret." Dottie did not offer to help that day. She just stood and watched, and before she left, she said one thing that lodged in Elara's mind like a splinter. "She tried to find you, you know. After your parents died, she called the state, the hospitals, the police. They would not tell her anything because she was not listed as family. Your father had made sure of that. She spent the last year of her life trying to get to you, and the system would not let her through. Alara sat in the chapel that night with the second cassette tape in her hands, the one labeled "For When You Are Ready." She was not ready. She knew she was not ready. But she also knew that readiness is a lie we tell ourselves to justify waiting, and she had been waiting her entire life. She put the tape in the player and pressed the button. Constance's voice filled the chapel again, but this time it was different. Weaker. The pauses between words were longer, and Alara could hear the effort it took to push air through vocal cords that were giving out. Alara. I know your name. I have always known your name. Your father wrote it in a letter he sent me when you were born. It was the only letter he ever sent me. 1 page. 3 sentences. Her name is Alara. She has my eyes. Do not come. Constance paused on the tape. The silence stretched. When she spoke again, her voice cracked. I did not come. That is the thing I cannot forgive myself for. He told me not to come, and I listened. I should have come anyway. I should have come and stood on his doorstep and refused to leave until he looked me in the eye and told me why. But I was afraid. I was afraid he would tell me the truth, and the truth was that I had failed him. That I had married a man who filled our house with fear, and I had stayed, and I had stayed, and I had stayed, and I had stayed, and by the time Harold died, the damage was already done. Daniel had already learned that love and fear are the same thing, and he spent the rest of his life running from both. The tape crackled. The land is yours, not because it is worth anything. The coal companies picked these mountains clean 50 years ago. But the chapel, Alara, the chapel was built in 1919 by your great-great-grandfather Josiah for a congregation that never had more than 14 people. He built it because he believed that every family needs a place where the truth can be spoken out loud without the walls falling down. I have tested that theory. I have spoken a great deal of truth in this room, and the walls are still standing. Another pause. Then, very quietly, under the third pew from the front, left side, the floorboard with the knot that looks like an eye. Lift it. The tape ended. Alara did not move for a long time. She could hear the wind outside pressing against the chapel walls, testing them, and the walls held. She walked to the third pew from the front, left side. She got on her hands and knees. The floorboard was there, and the knot was there, dark and round, staring up at her like an eye. She worked her fingers into the gap beside it and pulled. The board came up with a groan, and beneath it was a space, a narrow cavity between the floor joists. And in that space was a metal box, the kind people used to keep cash in during the Depression, when banks were just buildings where your money went to die. She opened it. Inside was a photograph, a single photograph, and when Alara saw it, the sound she made was not a word. It was something older than language, something that came from a place in her chest that she had kept locked since she was 9 years old. The photograph showed a woman sitting on the steps of this chapel, holding a baby. The woman was young, maybe 20, with dark hair and a jaw that Alara recognized because she saw it every morning in whatever mirror she could find. The baby was wrapped in a quilt, and on the back of the photograph, in handwriting that was steady and sure, not yet shaken by age, Constance had written, Daniel, 3 weeks old. I will love you until the mountains fall down. And even then, beneath the photograph was a bank document, a savings bond purchased in 1971, the year the chapel was sealed, in the amount of $500. Alara's hands trembled as she read the maturity clause. 50-year term, compounding interest. She was not a mathematician, but she understood enough to know that $500 left alone for 50 years does something that feels like magic, but is really just patience turned into numbers. She took the bond to the bank in Harlan the following Monday. The teller looked at it, looked at her, looked at the bond again, and left to get the manager. The manager was a woman named Price, who wore reading glasses on a chain and took 17 minutes to verify the document. The bond was worth $41,000. Alara sat in the bank chair and covered her mouth with both hands. $41,000. Constance had sealed that bond in the chapel in 1971, knowing that whoever opened it would need it. knowing somehow that the person who came for it would be someone with nothing. Spring came to the mountains the way it always does, not all at once, but in whispers. A patch of green here, a bud splitting open there, the creek at the bottom of the hill unfreezing with a sound like glass breaking in slow motion. Elara used the money carefully. She hired a licensed electrician from Harlan to wire the chapel with a proper electrical panel. She had a well drilled, the drill punching through limestone for 2 days before hitting water so cold and clean it tasted like the mountain itself. She insulated the walls with rigid foam board, cutting each piece herself with a utility knife, pressing them into the spaces between the studs, sealing the gaps with spray foam that expanded in yellow curls like something alive. She kept the pews. She sanded them by hand, spending 3 weeks on her knees with progressively finer sandpaper until the oak emerged from beneath decades of grime, the grain rich and golden, smelling of something ancient and warm. She refinished them with tung oil, rubbing it in with a cloth, and when the light came through the windows in the late afternoon, the wood seemed to glow from inside, as if the trees they had been cut from still remembered being alive. Dottie came back. This time she brought a casserole and a woman named June who was 81 and had once been the church organist. June stood in the doorway and started to cry, quietly, the way old women cry when they see something they thought was gone forever. "Looks the same," June whispered. "Smells the same." She sat in the first pew and ran her hands over the wood and told Elara stories about Constance. How Constance had made pies for every funeral in the county. How she had taught herself to play piano from a book she ordered from a catalog in 1958. How she had walked 4 miles each way to the post office every Monday morning for decades to mail a letter that never got a response, and how she never once complained about it. Not once, not in 40 years. By the 3rd month, the chapel had a wood stove that worked, a small kitchen built into what had been a storage closet, a composting toilet in a shed. Elara built herself from lumber salvaged from a collapsed barn down the road, and a loft she framed above the altar, where she slept on a mattress she bought for $60 from a yard sale in Evarts. She slept beneath the cross her great-great-grandfather had carved, and some nights when the wind was right, she could hear the chapel breathing. The wood expanding and contracting with the temperature, the settling sounds that old buildings make when they are remembering how to be inhabited. It sounded like a heartbeat. Slow, steady, patient. People began to stop by. Not many. A handful. An older man named Curtis, who had lost his wife and did not know what to do with his Sundays anymore. A young mother named Sala, whose husband had left her with 2 children and a trailer with a broken heater. A teenager named Martin, who did not say why he came, and Elara did not ask. She did not hold services. She was not a preacher and did not pretend to be. But she opened the chapel doors on Sunday mornings and made coffee on the wood stove and set out whatever Dottie or June had brought. Biscuits or cornbread or sometimes just a jar of apple butter and a sleeve of crackers. And people sat in the pews and talked or did not talk, and the chapel held them the way a cupped hand holds water, gently, without squeezing. One Sunday in late May, Elara was sitting alone in the chapel after everyone had gone when she noticed something she had not seen before. The cross on the wall behind the altar, the one Josiah had carved in 1919, had something on the back. She had never taken it down. It was heavy, mounted with iron brackets that had been driven deep into the wall studs. But something about the light that evening, the way it angled through the west window and cast shadows differently than it had before, showed her a shape on the wall behind the cross that should not have been there. She stood on a chair and lifted the cross off its brackets. It took all her strength. Behind it, carved into the wall itself, was a message. Not written. Carved. Each letter cut into the wood with the same chisel that had made the cross. It said, "This chapel stands because the women held it up. Josiah built the walls. Mary held them together. When the men went into the mountain and did not come back, the women stayed and kept the doors open. Remember that this building is not made of wood. It is made of staying." Elara stood on the chair with the cross in her arms and read those words 3 times. Then she hung the cross back on the wall, carefully, the way you hang something that is both a shield and a window. That night she played the second tape again. She had listened to it so many times, the ribbon was wearing thin, and Constance's voice had taken on a quality that was almost translucent, like light passing through old glass. But this time she heard something she had missed before. At the very end of the tape, after Constance's last words, after the instruction about the floorboard, there was a sound. Not words, a melody. Constance was humming. A hymn Alara did not recognize, slow and minor key, the kind of song that lives in the space between grief and gratitude. And Alara realized she had heard it before. Not on the tape, in her memory. A memory so old and so buried that it felt less like remembering and more like being remembered. Her father, Daniel, sitting on the edge of her bed when she was 4 or 5 years old, humming that same melody, not singing the words, just the tune. As if the words were something he could not bring himself to say, but the music was something he could not stop his body from carrying. He had kept that hymn. Through everything, through the leaving and the silence and the lie he told about his mother being dead, he had kept the melody. He had carried it across 20 miles in 25 years and given it to his daughter without ever telling her where it came from. Alara sat in the chapel her great-great-grandfather had built, and her grandmother had guarded and listened to the humming fade into the hiss of old tape. And she understood something that Constance had been trying to tell her across 55 years and 2 cassette tapes and hundreds of letters tied with kitchen string. The things we cannot forgive are the things we cannot stop loving. And the things we cannot stop loving are the things that save us, not because they are perfect, but because they are ours. She looked around the chapel, the pews glowing in the lamplight, the wood stove ticking as the fire burned down, the window she had uncovered, letting in the last blue light of a May evening in the Kentucky mountains, the altar where her grandmother's voice had waited, patient and faithful, for the day someone would come and press play. Outside, the first fireflies of summer were rising from the grass, their light pulsing in a rhythm that looked almost like breathing. And the chapel walls were still standing, the way they had been standing for over 100 years, not because the wood was strong, but because the women who cared for them refused to let go. Alara pulled the blanket around her shoulders and leaned back against the pew. She was not home. She knew that. Home is not a place you find. It is a place you build with your hands and your stubbornness, and the memory of a voice you almost forgot, a voice humming a song whose words you may never learn, rising from an altar in a chapel that someone loved enough to keep sealed for 55 years, waiting in the cold and the dark and the silence, for you. Just for you.